My name is Colonel John Croft, late of the Royal Engineers, and I'm talking about my father, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Croft, Royal Engineers, who was a prisoner of the Japanese and was captured in Singapore in February 1942. My father, then a lieutenant, was sent to Singapore in 1938. He was involved in the construction of defences, including the building of coastal artillery gun emplacements and barracks for reinforcing units. I was born in 1938 and with my mother joined my father by trooper in Singapore that year. My mother and I left Singapore on the SS Narkunda on the 16th of January and went to Australia as refugees. We then returned by troopship in convoy to England via South Africa, zigzagging across the Atlantic to avoid the U-boats and arriving in the spring of 1943. My father fought on the island until the surrender on the 15th of February 1942. In the last few months before the surrender, bombing and shelling of the island increased to over 4,000 bombs and shells an hour. This caused an immense amount of damage, and so the Royal Engineers, known as sappers, were tasked with making emergency repairs, especially to the water supply system and the roads. These were continually being destroyed. In addition, over 1,000 sappers went into battle as infantry. When it was realised that the surrender was imminent, the sappers were engaged in destroying all equipment and stores that could be useful to the Japs. This included oil for ships, ammunition and weapons, machinery and alcohol, the latter to avoid the Japanese massacring our troops and the civilian population in a drunken state. One of the main reasons that the governor ordered the surrender was to save the civilian population, who were very short of water due to the bombing and were dying from war wounds and disease, including dysentery. My father and other sappers were engaged in repairing water mains that had been destroyed by the bombing. After the surrender, most troops, including my father, were ordered to march to Changi prisoner of war camp. They continued to repair the water mains throughout the city after surrender. A few months after the fall of Singapore, captured troops were split up into 3 groups. These were sent to the notorious railway in Thailand, those sent overseas as slave labour, and those who remained imprisoned in Singapore. In August 1942, along with other engineers and senior officers, my father was sent by a very old, slow, rusty tramp steamer, first to Formosa, now called Taiwan, and then on to Japan in another old tramp ship. The ships were very overcrowded, had poor facilities, and the filthy living conditions were insanitary and appalling. There was very little food, and the lack of air below deck was suffocating. Consequently, a number of those on board died on each journey and were buried at sea. On arrival in Formosa, captives were disembarked and marched for many miles inland, where they were put to work in the quarries, lifting and moving large stones. They left Singapore with only their hospital tropical kit, and consequently many died of the cold and disease. Officers too were made to work, even though the Geneva Convention forbade it. On the 14th of November 1942, they departed from Formosa. Their group was joined on board by American and Dutch prisoners from the Philippines and Indonesia. They arrived in Japan 11 days later. Camped in the dockyards in Yokohama in wooden huts, they were put to work on shipbuilding and repair for the Mitsubishi Company, which they did with great reluctance and endeavoured to sabotage with some success the work being carried out. The treatment by the Japs was atrocious, as it was throughout their time in captivity. Everyone was beaten up, often and badly treated, including the sick and the dying. The Japs openly enjoyed doing this. The poor food, lack of facilities, warm clothing and accommodation resulted in sickness and a steady stream of deaths throughout their time there. The prisoners had to bury the dead or take them to the crematorium by handcart. My father was made camp carpenter because of his engineering skills. He made a range of facilities for the prisoners, including an air conditioning unit for the sick bay, about 200 drinking mugs made from empty beer bottles. This is one of them. And 3 clarinets out of bamboo to accompany the entertainment made by the prisoners. On the 12th of May 1945, the prisoners were sent by rail to Kosaka in the north of Honshu Island, in overcrowded carriages, taking 3 days. Here they were put to work in a copper smelting factory. Conditions in the countryside were more pleasant than in Yokohama, but it was very much colder. My father was able to repair a local generator and water turbine and keep them running that supplied the village and the camp with electricity, and so again he avoided having to work for the enemy. On the 18th of August 1945, they heard that the war had ended on the 15th. The Japanese became progressively more friendly, providing better food, even though the local population was also very short of it. The prisoners took over the camp, and inmates were also able to visit other camps nearby. Morale and health improved quickly. On the 24th of August, they received instructions to identify the camp from the air. At this, emotions ran high 3.5 years after the last contact with their people. On the 27th of August, planes from the US carrier Bennington flew over and dropped notes and copies of the ship's newspapers. They were followed by 16 torpedo bombers that dropped packages by parachute into the camp yard. Over the following days, many more packages were dropped containing food, clothing, magazine and other comforts. The messages dropped by the aircrew were very heartening, telling them they would soon be repatriated. On the 10th of September 1945, they were taken by train to the coast, then out to a US hospital ship for medical checkups, debriefing and rekitting. The next day they were transferred to a fast American destroyer, which took them to Yokohama at a steady 32 knots. On the 13th of September, the British and Australians parted with the Americans and went by landing craft to the battleship HMS King George V, where their details were taken and they sent radio messages home. My father sent my mother one saying, "Safe in Allied hands and in good health." They then transferred to the British aircraft carrier HMS Ruler and left for Australia to a tremendous send-off from the combined anchored fleet. The carrier arrived in Sydney on the 27th of September to a great welcome from the shore. My father flew from Sydney to Lyneham in Wiltshire on the 28th of October, arriving on the 10th of November, 7.5 years after leaving England. He went to the reception centre in London and finally reached home in Hampshire on the 11th of November 1945, rejoining our family 3.75 years after parting from us in Singapore. My father served in the Corps until 1960 and remained fit and well, took no medication and died aged 91 years in 1997. He supported the Royal Engineers Association from his early days in the Corps.